it really is an honor to welcome Peter Hammer here. He is an expert in demystifying systemic racism, and he's going to talk about how we can work together to overcome it. He does a lot of things. He teaches law at Wayne State University. He is the director of the Damon Keith Center for Civil Rights. And the Keith Center is dedicated to promoting the educational, economic, and political empowerment of underrepresented communities in urban areas. And this is the part I really like. And to ensuring the phrase that equal justice under law applies to all members of society. And I've read that multiple times and I get chills every time I read that. But his experience extends beyond Detroit and the US. One example is that he has spent 25 years engaging in issues of human rights, law, and development in Cambodia. He's a founding board member and past president of Legal Aid of Cambodia. And he was just sharing with me about an organization he's now involved in there as well. So I certainly haven't done him justice. There is a lot that he brings to our world and to all of us here today. And so I'm going to give him a chance to expand. And just quickly before I do that, I also want to introduce Liz Cantor-Groskind, who is an SVP board member and the chair of our equity committee. She's a dear friend, and she is going to facilitate the conversation with Peter today. So Liz, maybe you can say a quick hi, and then Peter will let you introduce yourself and we'll continue on with the conversation.
Good morning, everyone. And I don't want to take any time away from Peter, so I'm just going to hand it right off.
Great. Thank you, Liz and Sierra. Real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the check-in. So that gives me a much deeper sense of who is here and what we're all collectively leaving to spend some time together. So I'm going to start the screen share and walk through a presentation. It's going to be broken in two parts. I think 40 minutes is too long to talk at people. So the first part will be approximately 20 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to break and take your questions, right? So just think about what you want to discuss that may be triggered from the presentation. And then we'll go through the second half of the presentation and have another opportunity for Q&A. But I think about this in terms of structural racism 101 and try to think about the basic training that we all need to be effective citizens and thinking about structural racism and thinking about racial equity. And the first half is really going to be trying to get us to understand where we are in the present moment, right? And how to learn to see spatial structural racism, right? And that whole sort of notion of what we see and don't see will be a theme that will be going throughout the presentation. But the claim I would start with is that the name George Floyd has really come to symbolize the cumulative effect of 400 years of racism in America. And we don't face just one pandemic, we faced at least two pandemics. One is of police brutality. The other obviously is the racially disparate impact that is coming from COVID-19. And my claim is that these are interrelated. By the end of this, you'll sort of see the justification for the claim. But the claim is that COVID can be seen as the intersection between structural racism and the politics of fiscal austerity. Right? And that police brutality can be better understood as the intersection between structural racism and themes of militarism. But unfortunately, our society, our schools teach nothing about this, right? And that leads to one of my favorite questions, why? If this is so critical to our current, past, and to our future, why don't we collectively have a better understanding about the way that race and racism functions in our society? And the truth is, once we learn to see, we see it everywhere, right? Because racism is hiding in plain sight. And that's just not my insight. You can go back to Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man, which is still a wonderful read. And that's the major theme of this, that he's invisible because people refuse to see him, right? Indeed, you could go further and think about how European Americans are really trained and socialized since birth and childhood not to see the racism that surrounds them. And there's a wonderful new field of knowledge called the epistemology of ignorance, right? We need an epistemology, a theory of knowledge, and that's important. But in trying to really get to the depth of these types of issues, we also have to think about how ignorance is constructed. And the subfield of that is white ignorance. And a wonderful resource there is Charles Mill's book, The Racial Contract. And I'll provide these slides. I already have, if people want to just sort of focus and have access to some of the substantive citations later. Now contrast that with the experience of Americans of color. Americans of color confront racism every day of their lives, right? And indeed, Judge Damon J. Keith, the namesake of our center, used to say that there was not a day, right, that in some way, big or small, that he wasn't reminded that he was a Black man in America. And this is coming from one of the greatest jurists this country has ever produced. And yet that's his lived experience. Some of the implications of that is that European Americans like myself really need to be on a lifelong journey to unlearn much of we've been taught and to relearn how to see again. And part of that seeing again is acknowledging the expertise, the experience of Americans of color, right? Because they understand racism. They experience racism in ways that I do not, and have a much deeper understanding of the dynamics and the physics of racism. And that knowledge needs to be centered and honored and respected as we think about how to deal with these issues. I sometimes joke that if you wanted to build a bridge, you would not go to an engineer that didn't see gravity, right? In the same way, if you want to confront racism, you don't go to a person that doesn't see color, right? Color is real, race is real, and as George Floyd and others remind us, it can be deadly. So let's go through an illustration of what that means, right? And I'm going to be focusing on Detroit, right? But you can apply that where you're living now. You can apply it to where you grew up. And part of the prompt that I'm going to give at the end of this session is for you to have some dialogue with me about how Detroit is similar to Tucson and how it's different from Tucson, right? And we're going to have lists on both sides. But I want to get you to see and understand the dynamics of spatial racism that define Southeast Michigan and the Detroit metropolitan area. But I often want to step back before we do an exercise like that and kind of reframe things and create a different benchmark. So I often ask, what if people were gas molecules, right? And if you're an adult like me, we forget what we learned in chemistry. If you present this to a high school audience, they're just all eager to tell you what they just learned. If I brought 5 different gases into the room that I am and released them in a relatively short period of time, those gases would be uniformly distributed. So no matter where I sample, I would get the same distribution of gases. But we know that people don't act like gas molecules, which leads us then to ask, well, what are the social, the political, the economic, and sometimes the physically violent forces that are necessary to make us not act like gas molecules and that actually shape demographic patterns of segregation? And I try to give people mantras you can take home with you, right, to sort of play with these ideas wherever you're living. And one of those mantras is the spatialization of race and the racialization of space, right? So think about where you live. Think about how space is often racialized, right? And think about how race is often spatialized. And we start to understand that connection. We start to see that the past really didn't go anywhere, that the present is shaped by the past. And we'll talk later about how that happens in a dynamic interaction between beliefs and institutions. But if I start to learn to see in this way, I will start finding archaeological evidence of spatial structural racism almost everywhere, right? So that's at least the challenge, or that's at least the claim and objective. And lots of resources, right? Sundown towns is exactly what the sign says. Whites only within city limits after dark, right? And sundown towns were not in the South. They were predominantly in the North and in the West. And there's a website associated with this book. So you can go and look at Arizona and you can track down all of the sundown towns that existed in Arizona. And if you want, again, sort of further deep dive in this notion of the spatialization of race and the racialization of space, George Lipsett's book, How Racism Takes Place, is again, a wonderful resource. But I'm going to approach this issue about seeing spatial structural racism through a tool of opportunity mapping, right? And these maps were produced by the Michigan Roundtable and the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State University. And opportunity mapping is just what you think it is, right? Anything that can be measured can be mapped, right? And we define opportunity in ways that I think would be intuitive to you. The quality of housing, right? Availability and quality of jobs, quality of schools, access to public and private healthcare, access to public and private transportation, right? Food security. Can you easily buy fresh fruits and vegetables? What's the quality of the living environment, right? So we measure all those things and we map it. And again, I sometimes joke that we have opportunity experts in this country that you have to take a state test and pass it. You have a state license to practice opportunity. And we call those opportunity experts real estate agents, right? And real estate agents understand this opportunity on a granular block by block level. And one of the great things about America is if you have money, you can buy opportunity, right? And conversely, if you don't have money, you may not have access to the same opportunities that others do. So imagine wherever you're living, right? And imagine Tucson for those in Tucson, and think about where there's areas of high opportunity and think about where there's areas of low opportunity, right? And in your mind's eye, paint the areas of high opportunity in dark, rich colors, right? And paint the areas in the map of low opportunity in light, pale colors. right? So if you're in outer space looking down now at Southeast Michigan where the map will be, and you could only see the presence or absence of opportunity, this is the map that you would see, right? And I think you can follow my cursor. So you can see this part of the map being light pale, which means an absence of opportunity. That has a geopolitical name, which is Pontiac, right? And Pontiac is in Oakland County, which historically has been one of the richest counties in the country. So we have an opportunity desert surrounded by a sea of opportunity. If you come down here, you can almost see 8 Mile, the demarcation of the boundary of Detroit, is an opportunity desert, right? And those that know Michigan could come over here to the Grosse Points and find areas of high opportunity, and we find high areas of opportunity elsewhere. So what we have here when we measure and map opportunity is we see a high segregation of wealth and opportunity. The next map is going to overlay demographic information. And it will be a story in black and white. And I always acknowledge that means some people are not going to see themselves represented, right? And so acknowledging that. But for teaching purposes, the story in black and white is pretty powerful. You're going to see green dots, right? And the green dots represent a predominant African-American population by census tract. And if I overlay the demography to the opportunity, this is what I get in Southeast Michigan, right? I sort of toggle back and forth a little bit, right? And what you see here is not only the segregation of wealth and opportunity, but the segregation, the hyper-segregation of race, wealth, and opportunity. And that's what people like John Powell call spatial racism, right? And a new report came out from the Othering and Belonging Institute this summer that showed that Detroit has reclaimed its status as the #1 segregated community in the country, right? And at this point, I always pause, right? And this is a very important lesson to take hold. This is a story about systems and not individuals, right? So this is a story about systems and not individuals. When I see this absence of opportunity, what I'm really mapping is the absence of opportunity infrastructures, right? To create opportunity, I need elaborate political, economic, social infrastructures that require sustained investment. So the opportunity deserts are area where I have had decades, right? Sometimes half a century or more of disinvestment in opportunity infrastructures. Right? But they can be seen if we want to start seeing it. And I don't think it's very hard to argue that impacts any social policy issue you care about, right? Care about education, you need that map. Care about wealth, you need that map. Care about municipal distress or emergency management or tax foreclosures or water shutoffs or life expectancy or maternal mortality, right? You need to understand that map, right? And yet I will guarantee, and Liz can verify from the time that she was in Detroit, you never see that map in the newspaper. You never see that map on the evening news. And that's another example of the construction of ignorance, right? We have to hide maps like this. We have to hide these systemic relationships, right? But furthermore, if we don't know the root causes, none of our policies are going to work, right? So it's not shocking that we've spent decades trying to deal with issues like education or childhood asthma without substantial success, right? All right, and again, Detroit is not alone. So I stole this from one of the demographic dot maps, and you can do this in any community, and you see what it looks like in Tucson, right? And the African-American population is not like it is in Detroit, where Detroit is the largest majority Black city, right? You have to really start searching for African-American communities, but you clearly see a segregation of white and Latino persons, right? You kind of see down there. And again, I don't know Tucson, so I'm just sort of going to be interpolating from what I've seen elsewhere in the nation. It's also interesting that it's separated by a highway, right? So the creation of public transportation and the history of the creation of public transportation wasn't designed to disrupt patterns of segregation. A lot of very intentional federal policies have been designed over the years to actually facilitate the further resegregation of different populations. All right, so kind of think about how opportunity maps onto Tucson. All right, again, I've sort of stole these from different reports and sections. This is poverty rates by race and ethnicity. And again, you know the opportunity infrastructures, right? You know where they exist in Tucson. So this is data from Tucson. The white population has under 15% poverty rates, right? And my mouse is, there it is. I go down, I'm going to sort of just track the 15% and see who's above and below it. African Americans substantially above 15%, even into 27, 28%. Then I get American Indians and Native Alaskans, right, substantially higher than 15%. I'm almost at 35% poverty rates. Asian Americans higher than 15%, but lower than some of the other groups. Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, right, over 30%. Other category, almost 25%. Two or more races, over 20%. Hispanic population, well over 15% to about 22, 23%. White non-Hispanic is the only category that's below the white categorization up here. Right. So that's a way to just kind of prime your own thinking about how these kinds of maps, how these kind of analysis, how these kind of structures create opportunities for some and deny opportunities for others. So the second part is trying to understand the multiple dimensions of race and racism and the production and reproduction of systems of oppression, trying to get us to think of these in dynamic terms. And there's kind of three new tools or frames that we use at the Key Center. And I may or may not get up through all of them. So I'm not going to kind of race to finish it. We'll sort of see how far we go. But one thing we need to do is have more sophisticated understandings of the way that race and racism functions. Second thing we need to do is have better understandings of the dynamic production and reproduction of racial inequality. And we'll do that through a simple dialectic between belief systems and institutions, right? And third, we need to have better models of this deep interconnectedness of social challenges, what we use at the Key Center in terms of issue clusters, right? How things that otherwise look like they're separate problems are actually interconnected, right? And I alluded to that in the discussion of COVID and the discussion of police brutality at the very beginning. Right. You could spend 2 hours on this slide, right? There's a whole lot here. And I promise you we won't spend 2 hours, right? But this is underlying the need to have more sophisticated understandings of race and racism, right? If you were to ask most Americans, right, what is racism, they would likely talk about intentional discrimination or express discrimination, right? And that certainly exists. That certainly must be fought. It is more extensive at this point in history than any time I ever thought it would be in my lifetime. So I don't want to minimize that. But with a graphic constructed like this, you can say that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? And it is. If you go down to the lower corner, you have forms of implicit bias. And when I say implicit bias, I'm really talking about a placeholder for all of the interesting cognitive science and cognitive psychology about the way that race is functioning in the brain, right? And we're learning a whole lot more just about the mechanics of how it functions. And if you wanted to, right, after the session, you could just Google Harvard implicit bias test. Right. And if you haven't taken it, I suggest that you do. And what it shows empirically is that a large majority of Americans, white Americans, have an implicit bias against African Americans. Right. It also shows that a substantial portion, although not nearly as large, of African Americans have an implicit bias against African Americans. Right. And what that tells you is that like a toxin, right, like a pathology in our society, it gets internalized. Right. And you have to sort of think about the multiple way that racism is functioning and how it affects both European Americans and people of color in very detrimental and negative ways. I already gave you the definition of structural racism, but we learned through repetition, right? So structural racism, as we approach it, is the inter-institutional dynamics that produce and reproduce racially disparate outcomes over time, right? And let's give an example. And the example I often use are wealth disparities, right? So think about the average white American family. Think about the average Black American family, right? And the spoiler alert is that the white family has more wealth, right? And the question then is how much more? And if we were in person, I'd try to do this auction exercise to get some community interaction and have you guess how much more, right? But the studies show, and it depends on how you do it, that the average white family has 10 to 13 times more wealth, right, than the average Black family, right? And if you did not know that, ask yourself why and put an asterisk by white ignorance, right, or the epistemology of ignorance. Why is that not commonly known, right? If you did not know that, I hope that feels like somebody hit you in the stomach, right? I hope you're feeling this viscerally about this kind of disparity. But if I go back to my definition, what is the interinstitutional dynamics? How did the housing sector intersect with the transportation sector, intersect with the education sector, intersect with the job sector, intersect with the health sector to produce and then reproduce that racially disparate outcomes over time, right? And that really is the deep inquiry of structural racism as that we are approaching it and framing it at the Key Center. Right. I sometimes teach this in 2 slides. And in the first slide, I just have the middle part of the pyramid with question marks. Well, what's the hydraulics? What drives a system like this? What could possibly make this happen over centuries, right? And the truth is it's all about power. right? And I think people can accept that. The truth is also, in my truth or my understanding, that power in the United States has been all about white supremacy, right? And I know using language like that sometimes gets people's shoulders to go up and gets people to be tense. So I do the following exercise, right? I would say everybody here would agree that slavery was grounded in notions of white supremacy, right? And I think everybody can shake their head up and down, right? Then I would say, and I think everybody would agree, that Jim Crow, segregation, was grounded in notions of white supremacy, right? And then I just let a question hang in the air. That was 60 years ago, right? 70 years. Where did it go, right? What did happen to it, right? And let you puzzle over that. But my claim is that you have to have honest discussions about the role of power and the role of whiteness if you're going to have adequate discussions about the role of race, right? So that's sort of one frame. The second frame is doing this deeper dive about the dynamic reproduction of racial inequality, right? And so we talk about this dialectic between beliefs and institutions, right? And beliefs really are the sort of the myths that we tell, the sort of worldviews that we have, and they produce order and meaning, right? Religion functions as a belief system, right? In America, sometimes economics functions as a belief system, mythologies function as a belief system, and we need them, right? They help make social stories that give order, right? Then we have the institutions, right? And the institutions can be thought of as the rules, the laws, the norms that govern society. And the following insight I pull from Douglas North, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economic historian. He says you can think about the belief system as the internal manifestation of the external institutions, right? And that you can think about the institutions as the external manifestations of the internal belief systems, right? And the beliefs help shape the institutions help shape the beliefs, and you have the sort of interesting multiple and reciprocal forms of causation, right? So we want to kind of use that structure to think about how race, structural racism gets produced and reproduced over time. But again, I always like to step back, right? So just as we talked about gas molecules, I want to focus on two myths, or at least I'll call them myths, which I believe are of peculiarly Western origin, right? And we're going to see how this lets us see that these belief systems, these myths, shape so much of our thought and action, right? And one myth I would claim is that time is linear, right? So where's the past? Well, the past is way, way over there. And where's the future? It's in the opposite direction, very, very far away. And in America, we have a myth of progress. So things are always getting better. So I can tilt my linear line. So we think that time is linear, right? Then we think that race is marginal, right? Get over it, right? It's just marginal. It's not a significant part. And think about how these two beliefs, right, come together, right? And what are the implications on their thought and action? Well, what would happen if I were to say, let's talk about reparations, right? To most Americans' way, slavery was a long time ago, right? My family didn't own slaves, right? Get over it, right? And if I have this myth of progress, well, we just solved that problem, right? You should, you had 200 years, 150 years to catch up and to get better. But it means that if I combine these two beliefs, that I can ignore past injustices, right? And I don't have to take care of them, and the problems will solve themselves, right? If I flip those two myths, right? Historically, if you go back sort of from human history, right? In vast, sort of murky pre-modern times, and into any agricultural society today, most people would have a frame that would think about time as cyclical, right? I've got summer, I've got fall, I've got winter, I've got spring, and the cycle repeats itself, right? The second thing is to think about race as central, right? So if I think about time as cyclical, where's the past, right? Well, the past, I guess, is in some way behind me, if there is such a thing as behind me in the cycle, but it's also ahead of me, right? And it's also with me, right? The past really didn't go anywhere in this framework. And if time is cyclical and race is central, if I didn't resolve the tensions inherent in slavery, I get a reproduction into Jim Crow segregation. And if I don't resolve the tensions of Jim Crow segregation, I get a reproduction in terms of systems of spatial racism and the other sets of problems that we have today. But if I just flip those two beliefs, my brain is already primed to be thinking about social production and reproduction, right? And that's the kind of mindset that we all have to be in if we're going to take this sort of dynamic story and take a train ride, right? And the train will take us from slavery to Jim Crow, right? And then from Jim Crow into forms of spatial racism that we find in the North and in the West. And again, the first stop is easy for people to make, right? Because it's easy to judge history. It's easy to judge people who are not us, right? The Civil War ended the institution of slavery, no doubt about it. But the racialized belief systems that supported it lived on, right? And so it's not hard to start imagining how after the failure of Reconstruction and the issuance into redemption, you kind of fill in all the different historical points in your own mind, that the institutions, the laws, the rules, the norms simply mutate themselves into a form of social segregation that we call Jim Crow. Right? So we have a social reproduction of one system of oppression transmuting itself through beliefs and institutions into another system of oppression. Right? So that's the first stop on the train ride. Second stop is how do we get to spatial racism? Right? And there's an old adage, and some of you may know it or it may be new to some others, but the adage goes that in the South, you can be close, but you cannot be equal. Right? And a lot of the social relations between blacks and white in the South historically and even today have some degree of social intimacy, closeness, right? But you could not be equal, right? Now in the North, and I grew up on the West Coast, so North and I'd extend that to the West, right? You can be equal because we don't like to think that we discriminate against anybody, but you can't be close. Right? So racism in the North and the West have peculiar spatial components, geographic components, that spatialization of race and racialization of space that give you the white flight, that give you the sort of spatial racism, that see the social reproduction, as I talked about earlier, of racialized space inside the city, now make entire cities like Detroit function as racialized space within a highly segregated white-based region. Right? And I often say that Detroit is ground zero for spatial racism, and I often further say that we are the new Selma, right? And again, I'm speaking as a Detroiter, that if we're not acting with the intentionality that we're the new Selma, then we deserve to be judged by future generations by our inactions, right? And at the Key Center, we often say that spatial racism, structural spatial racism is our generation's civil rights challenge. Right? And we have to approach it with the same energy and creativity and ingenuity as our elders and ancestors fought the first civil rights challenge. All right, so again, deep breath, that's the second frame, right? How do we think about the social production and reproduction of these issues, right? The third frame is to try to start thinking about deep interconnectivity of social challenges, right? How, if we frame things differently, we start to see things as interconnected and coming out of the same problems as opposed to being separate, right? And to do this, it's also, again, helpful to have things that can talk about things that are complicated, but make them simple, right? So if you go back to Dr. King, right, and this was in the speech when he just came out against the war in Vietnam in 1967, he said the three evils in our society were racism, militarism, and materialism, right? And I want to think about those things as intersections, right? Rather than separately and standalone. So think about what happens when I have an intersection between racism and materialism, right? And here I'm thinking about materialism, I'm thinking about the economy, I'm thinking about fiscal austerity, I'm thinking about budgets, right? And then think about what happens when I have an intersection between racism and militarism, right? And think about how those get formed. And we're going to do that through that dialectic between beliefs and institutions, right? And I put this forward to you to consider, right? So think critically as well, right? Think empathetically, try to understand the argument, but also test it against your life experience. You might have refinements, improvements to this kind of modeling, and those are certainly welcome as well. But if I think about fiscal austerity, and this is my placeholder for the materialism, as a belief system, this is how I would start saying, what is the components of that belief system? Very strong belief in markets, right? And a fear from the state, right? And if you remember Ronald Reagan, as people of our age do, what we would say is the worst thing that can happen, somebody knock on your door and say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, right? Hyper sense of property rights, right? Everything's about private property, maintaining private property, privileging private property. Hyper sense of individualism, right? If you remember when Obama went to that business in the suburb or in the warehouse that had said, well, think about all the public goods that were necessary to make this possible. Think about the roads, think about public education, and that huge backlash said, no, I made this, right? It's me. And remember, I reminded you, this was a story of systems and not individuals. That's not how we're socialized, right? We're socialized to think about individuals, and we're not socialized or taught to think about systems and how systems function. Right? This belief system marginalized the role of structure in social context. It has a built-in mechanism of blame and punishment, right? So we have this false meritocracy Many of you could finish the sentence for me, right? Because this is part of our collective conscious, not part of our individual conscious. In America, if you work hard, you will succeed, right? And now I invert that syllogism. If you did not succeed, you did not work hard, right? If you did not work hard, you are blameworthy. If you're blameworthy, you can be punished, right? And so a lot of this belief system is hardwired to actually intentionally punish those that don't succeed on the belief that that will make them better, right? Because it doesn't see systems, right? It doesn't see that opportunity network that I talked about earlier, right? And in Detroit, that plays out in shutting people's water off, right? More than 140,000 households, right? And you think I spoke wrong, or you think there's something wrong with the audio. More than 140,000 households, right, which have somewhere from 2.4 to 2.7 people in them, have had their water shut off since 2012. Right? To me, that's a humanitarian disaster. But think about the logic. You didn't pay your bills, you're blameworthy. You're blameworthy, you can be punished. The punishment now is shutting your water off, regardless if there's elderly, regardless if there's people with medical conditions, regardless if there's children, right? We've had more than 100,000 tax foreclosures, right? Where the government had actually overassessed the properties, leading them into foreclosure. And yet we blame people, all right? And so if you didn't pay your taxes, you didn't keep up, you're blameworthy. Another part of this is the myth of colorblindness, right? And I can do this in the questions if you want. My contention, remember I asked you where white supremacy went? White supremacy had a nephew or a child, and it's called colorblindness, right? If you do the genealogy of colorblindness now, in my analysis, it traces right back to white supremacy, right? And then this vilification of public goods and public processes. We can't even agree to pay for the roads anymore. We can't agree to pay for public education. We can't agree to pay for infrastructure, right? These are all part of this belief system of fiscal austerity. Well, if that's the internal manifestation, what's the external manifestation? What's the institutions? Minimal state, right? Unrestrained markets, privatization of public assets, minimal public workers or benefits, minimal respect for public employees, minimal social safety net. And in Detroit, the manifestation was emergency management that actually removed democracy and took the city into bankruptcy and produced a bankruptcy plan of adjustment that really says, depending upon what zip code it is, depends on what your opportunity is. Right, that you don't get social services if you're born in Detroit, right? But if you're born out on the other side of 8 Mile, well, you're entitled to it, right? So we have the belief system, we have the institutions, then we have the issue cluster. And at the core of the issue cluster is the logic of the system. That's the intersection between structural racism and fiscal austerity. And again, this is very Detroit sort of specific. So you got to think about how this applies to Tucson. In Detroit, that gave us emergency management, as I explained. Gave us poverty and health disparities. And we've already seen that there's interesting correlations between race and poverty in Tucson. Gave us the tax foreclosures we talked about, gave us the water shutoffs, gave us a bankruptcy plan of adjustment, and gave us a school system that is just failing everybody, right? But almost failing by design. And again, it's about systems, it's not about individuals. But what's beneficial about this kind of analysis is things that otherwise would be viewed as separate are now viewed as deeply interconnected and coming out of a core logic. So I think about the schools differently from this perspective if I just than I would if I were just looking at test scores, right? And I think this is a much richer way to be thinking about the way that structural racism is functioning in cities like Detroit, right? And we can do the same thing with this intersection between fear and militarism, right? And structural racism. The belief system, and again, these are, I'll use I statements, and you can critically examine and complement and add and subtract, but an exaggerated sense of masculinity, right? A sort of male dominance in this realm, conditioned action without reflection, right? To actually succeed as a soldier or police officer, you actually have to act often without thinking, right? And if that's happening in a highly racialized space, that's very dangerous, right? Privileges physical violence and force is the answer. Dominance of fear and defensiveness is a motivation. The need for an enemy, right? That has to have an other. And if there isn't, we have to create another. A glorification of loss and sacrifice, right? So if we actually saw bodies as bodies and viewed them as social cost as opposed to glorious sacrifices, we might question about why we're doing this. And this preoccupation on control. I got to control the physical body. I got to control the physical space. Internal manifestation to external manifestation. So how does that play out in the armed forces? How does that play out in the military industrial complex or the national security complex? How does that play out in the war on terror? How does that affect the Border Patrol, right? Issues that are very prevalent in Detroit, which is a border city, and in the Tucson area, which is deeply affected by the border. How is it affected on our police forces, our criminal justice system, and our schools, right? Our schools are dealt with oftentimes in the same mentality that we're dealing with in our military, right? And if I have an issue cluster now that is built around structural racism and militarism, that gives me George Floyd, right? And Michael Ferguson, right? And police brutality. That gives me Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow and Mass Incarceration. That gives me the school to prison pipeline. That gives me Islamophobia and hostility towards immigrants, right? And I would include the private security gated communities, right? And in Detroit, this preoccupation now upon surveillance as a means of keeping people safe, right? Now, if I used an issue cluster, I start to see how are these issues interconnected rather than separate, right? And I have a tool or a framework that can look at the deep interconnectivity. And I don't like being the prophet of doom, right? So I can tell you there's a lot of positive things happening in Detroit, and you might find analogs of those in Tucson. And think if we could flip this, right? What if we could build alternative sets of beliefs, right? What would those beliefs be, and what institutional structures, what programming, what new possibilities, what new rules, laws, and norms would it create? And in Detroit, we talked about equitable, people-focused development, right? Equitable, people-focused development. And again, if you're thinking about Dr. King, that's the beloved community, right? So if we had a belief system that was grained into the beloved community, what's an issue cluster? Right? So again, the logic is in the center, equitable, people-focused development. That would give me a community benefits ordinance, which we have in Detroit. So if you're using public money to subsidize private development, they have to negotiate with community members to make sure the community is benefiting from that development. That gives us community land trust, which can be one way to deal with affordable housing as a different kind of tool, but a different kind of model for property ownership and not private property. It gives us a water affordability plan that would be a sliding scale, a progressive scale, that if you had less, you paid less. If you had more, you paid more, which would be able to make water affordable for everybody and prevent water shutoffs. It would give us foreclosure relief. And we know if we keep people in their homes, we don't get blight. And blight is a huge issue in Detroit. It would give us environmental justice, right, to deal with the issue of lead in the paint and in the water. And would give us our latest rejected city charter, which had a Detroiters Bill of Rights, which was starting to think about the positive rights that citizens have and the obligations that government has to meet those basic needs and to create opportunity for everyone.
Is there anything that you didn't get asked that you'd like to touch upon or that you want us to walk away with today?
Yeah, so first off, Judge Keith had a whole lot of wonderful aphorisms, right? And one of his that sticks with me says, don't be an ingrate, right? So my first thing I want to say is just express gratitude, right? Gratitude to the organizers, gratitude for the people that participated, and thank you for spending time with me. But I also want to just say, I want to encourage people to think about this as a lifelong journey, right? That being born in this country means that we are being born in a deeply racist society. And I say that as systemic level, right? Not as a pointing blame on any individual, right? But we then have choices, right? And we can have choices to say that I can live in that sort of bubble of ignorance and be safe in my white suburban home and never have to go across whatever the street is in whatever city that we live in. Or we can, as John Powell says, we can become fully human, right? And the invitation in his thinking is that you can't become fully human until you transcend that racism, right? And so it's this universal call for all of us really to recognize the humanity in ourselves, right? But also to recognize the humanity in others, right? And to create that kind of bridging and relationships that will enable us both to understand each other, right? To seek leadership in other communities, and then to reflect that back about how we change our own conduct, right? So at the deal and the Key Center, we really try to be very holistic and about how we are trying to approach these issues strategically. And one of my other mentors who sadly passed, Mama Lila Cabell, would often say that racial equity works at the speed of relationships. Right. So being very intentional about building those relationships, cultivating those relationships, and not moving faster. Right. You got to say, what's the pace of the work? And the pace is different in different settings, not moving faster than the human component is going to enable it to be supported and let it be sustainable. But I know you're doing great work. I encourage all of you to keep at it and to think about the way systems work. Right, it's really an invitation to systems thinking, and we're not trained to do it. So it's not easy, it's not intuitive, but it's a skill that can be learned. And once you can learn it, it can be really transformative of the way that you start to understand what your work is and what paths forward you might be able to envision.